My name is David Buchbinder. I'm a special researcher on Chad and Sudan at Human Rights Watch. And what that means is that I go up and down the Chad-Sudan border, mostly on the Chad side, sometimes in West Darfur, and I document human rights violations. A lot of the work I do is gross violations, killings of civilians, militia violence against civilians, and I was there in March of 2006, and just doing the sort of making the rounds of the local hospitals, which is usually the first thing that I do. And there were a lot of people who had been wounded, gunshot wounds, machete wounds, and they had all come from the same small village near the border called Jawara. So I went with a colleague to Jawara, and we documented a massacre that had taken place, and we pieced together what had happened. And this was related to basically spill over the conflict from Darfur into eastern Chad. There were militia groups that were active in West Darfur that had made links with militia groups in eastern Chad. They started to work in coordination with one another. They were carrying out basically looting and cattle rustling raids, various locations on the Chad side of the border. And they got to Jawara, and they met resistance from the local self-defense force in Jawara. And it was not a real fair fight, because the local self-defense force is armed with bows and arrows, boomerangs, clubs, spears, and the militia group was armed with automatic weapons. And so what typically happens is during these cattle rustling raids, that if there's any resistance offered, there will be a very violent and overwhelming reprisal, and that's exactly what happened. So this militia group arrived in Jawara, stole some cattle. The local self-defense force gave chase, and then I believe one of the militia was killed or wounded. The militia then returned to Jawara and fired indiscriminately into the village. And my colleague and I went through. We found 3 mass grave sites, and there were many who could not be buried because villagers went back to bury their dead, and they were then attacked, shot at, and they had to flee. So it was a horrific scene, and we sort of pieced it together. We got names from various leaders, community leaders, witnesses, members of the community, and came up with a total of 118 that were killed in sort of a cluster of 4 villages that included Jawara. And we documented that and brought that to the attention of the world, and that is sort of atypical in the sense of the scale. Most of the violence that's sort of coming across the border is smaller in scale, more sort of low level, but it's typical in the sense of the pattern of violence, where it's in the immediate border area, and we'll have groups from Darfur linking up with groups in eastern Chad that have one kind of affiliation or another, and carrying out these violent attacks against civilians out there in eastern Chad.